hectic times like these, sometimes we just need to breathe. This fall, I've been presenting a series of sermons based on our principles, our Unitarian Universalist principles. And today we're going to look a little at our third principle. So, here it is, and I invite you all to share with me as we read this principle. We affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. So this is again one of those that looks like they put some things together. Let's unpack it a little bit to take these things out one by one and see what we might mean by these. The first part, acceptance of one another. That sort of goes back to our first principle, doesn't it, about the inherent worth and dignity of every person, that we're going to accept one another. And we like to think we do pretty good with that as Unitarian Universalists. This particular slide says being different is okay. If we were all the same, it would be boring. And we certainly don't want to be boring, so we like to think that one good thing about us is that we're not boring. You know, we're different, and that's okay. We're not boring. So acceptance of one another, but in a particular matter here, we've already said something about it in the first principle. This is acceptance of one another in spiritual growth, in the way we grow spiritually. So it's encouragement to spiritual growth. I found this visual that shows a tree growing and thought I'd use that to go along with the little exercise our children did. But spiritual growth together, accepting one another, and encouraging one another to spiritual growth. How much of that do we really do? But it says this is something we're going to lift up. This is something we affirm. Encouragement to spiritual growth. And then this last part gets left off a lot, I think. People don't think about that. And that is in our congregations. Not just go do your own thing. We like to do our own thing. That's good too. But encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. How can we do that as Unitarian Universalists? So, what is spiritual growth? Now, that depends on who you ask, doesn't it? You have a lot of folks who say, you know, they talk about religion, say, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. What does that mean? Well, probably every person you ask that says that, it may mean a different thing, you know. So what are we talking about when we talk about spiritual growth? Well, some people would say, you know, it's to become more Christ-like. That's what we mean by spiritual growth. Some may say it means to become more like Buddha. You know, your Buddha spirit within you. To explore and commit to the Tao, maybe that's spiritual growth. To submit to the pillars of Islam. If you're a Muslim person, that would be that submission to the pillars of Islam, maybe how you grow spiritually. To follow the laws of Yahweh or Jehovah. So that may be what you do as part of your spiritual growth. It may mean what it means to you. Many of us here might say spiritual growth for us might mean to increase our knowledge and connection to the universe, to the whole. And some folks may say it just means to grow your soul. Just grow your soul. Again, what that is depends on who's saying. Well, what would a unit? Now, somebody might say for spiritual growth for a mature soul, Christian mature soul, you can go read about Paul talking about that and how we start off eating the pablum, but then we need to move up to higher things, to the bread and other things and meat. What would a Unitarian Universalist say about a spiritually mature soul? Well, here's one. This is the Reverend Rob Hardy. He's the minister at All Souls Church Unitarian in Washington, D.C. A lot of Unitarian churches, Unitarian Universalist churches, are called All Souls churches. They name them that because they're welcoming all souls. So he's talking about spiritually mature souls and says, we need souls that can take in the world in all its complexity and diversity, yet still maintain our integrity. And we need souls that can love and be in relationship with all of this complexity. Instead of fight or flight, we need a spiritual posture of embrace. And wouldn't that be wonderful if we could do that in our world today, when all we're seeing is more fight and flight, instead of having a world of embracing. And certainly we want to be in a spirit of that ourselves. So that's what maybe a spiritually mature soul would look like. But how do we get there? How do we get there? Well, there may be different possibilities for that. I'm going to pull from this one, 5 Stages of Spiritual Growth by Scotty McClendon. Now, this was a guy that was the chaplain, I believe, at Harvard, and had a lot of folks asking about this kind of question. So he developed these 5 stages that he had observed that folks seem to go through as they grow spiritually. Now, he did not get these from the mountaintop with Moses. This is his ideas about it, what his observations are. You can agree or disagree with them. Thankfully, as Unitarian Universalists, we can do that, can't we? Some people don't like the stage idea anyway. They say, no, things are more in a spiral or more of a roller coaster. But we're going to look at his today, and his are in stages. So he says, very young children, and some adults too, may be in the magical stage, where everything is sort of magic for you. And we sort of lift that up, don't we, sometimes, especially with our young children. It's kind of nice and exciting when things seem very magical. But he says, as an adult, is your world full of spirits and demons? Are fairy tales your very favorite kind of literature? Do you think God makes everything happen for good and bad, that you might just pray and it'll happen magically? His words, not mine. That's what he would say. If you're one of those folks, maybe you would be in the magical stage. Then he says there's a stage he calls reality. I think I would call it more of a literalist stage. A literalist is what I would think I would call this. Here are the questions he asked for that. Do you spend a lot of time trying to determine what's real and what's not? Are scriptures true in a concrete and literal sense, rather than being stories and maxims that may or may not be real? And do you feel that you can influence God's actions by being good? Maybe if I'm good enough, we'll have more rain or less rain or whatever you're wanting. He said if you're in that kind, that he would call that being in the reality stage. As you move on up, the stage he has is called dependence, where you become very dependent on someone else or something else for your spirituality. The questions he asked, do you have a very important peer group or a leader who is primarily responsible for shaping your faith? And you would certainly expect that with younger folks. But what about as adults? Some adults, too, have a very important person that shapes their faith. Is it important to you to understand and follow religious doctrine and moral rules? Just tell me what to do. Tell me what to believe. Tell me what to do. Those people would be in this stage. And is your image of God that of a perfect parent? Is that how you see the divine? A perfect parent that you depend on. That's the dependent stage, dependence. And then he says some move from that to being more independent, the independent stage. There's a symbol for independence that I found. Many Unitarian Universalists would maybe feel like they've moved to a more independent stage. Is your spiritual life unique and personal? Not just like everybody else's in this room. Do you often find yourself wanting to demystify Scripture? Do you think of God, our ultimate reality, primarily as an impersonal force, the force be with you, or impersonal spirit, or as non-existent? You may be in what he would describe as the independent stage. And then some move on from that, from independence, to what we would call interdependence. We have a whole, one of our principles is about interdependence. So you see this interdependent group here. Do you find a spiritual community important to you at the same time that you maintain your own distinctive faith? So you may have your own distinctive faith, but you believe a spiritual community is important. You have an interdependent kind of spirituality. Do you experience spiritual power in religious symbols and myths that you can also analyze objectively? So the myths and the symbols are powerful to you, but you can analyze them objectively. And do you conceive of God or ultimate reality both as a person and as an impersonal force? These are his questions again, but he would see these as things that he might say folks that would answer yes to these questions, maybe in an interdependent stage. Then he has one more stage that I guess would be his highest. And that's when it all just comes together in unity. Unity. That's a symbol for unity. He says, if you answer yes to these questions, do you sense yourself in community with religious committed people of any and all traditions? Is your consciousness ego-free and beyond paradox and ambiguity? Just unified. Do you often feel that God or divine spirit is in everything and that everything exists in God or divine spirit? For him, if you answer these questions with yes, he would say that that's probably someone that's in that higher unity stage. When I think of folks like that, I think again about Shug in The Color Purple, from Alice Walker's Color Purple, when she said, one day when I was sitting quiet and feeling like a motherless child, which I was, it come to me, that feeling of being part of everything, not separate at all. I knew that if I cut a tree, my arm would bleed. That's what she was feeling, so unified that if she cut the tree, her arm would bleed. All the same, all unity. Now, I like Alice Walker's work, and you read her stuff, it's very spiritual, very spiritual. I recently read this book. I picked it up in a book sale at St. Simon's at the library. They have these things you can fill up a sack full for $5. So I had not read this. Have you read The Temple of My Familiar? It's a very spiritual book. Now, it's not a novel. In fact, this is how it's sort of a novel, but this is how one reviewer said. The Temple of My Familia is a novel only in a loose sense, rather as a mixture of mythic fantasy, revisionary history, exemplary biography, and sermon. It's short on narrative attention and long on inspirational message. But she has characters in here that I would call very spiritual characters, especially Miss Lissy. Now, Miss Lissy, she not only knows what you're thinking because she has dropped her ego. Y'all are all connected, so she knows what you're thinking. She not only knows that, she remembers her past lives, even remembers when she was a lion, L-I-O-N, roar. This Miss Lissy is very spiritual. I also just recently picked up this book and read it. Also very spiritual, folks, By the River. Is that Pedra or Pydra? I sat down and wept. Very spiritual folks in here too. So these would be some of the folks that are just so connected that they just let those egos down. Now, I'll be honest with you. I know some people like this in real life, not just characters. But the people that I know like this, maybe at one time they would be lifted up and called shamans or whatever, and maybe some places they still are. But the people that I know that are like that have a very difficult time in our society. They have a real hard time living in our society when they sort of let go of those ego boundaries, of self. So for me, now this is not, you may be different, but for me, I say I can go fat-free, gluten-free, caffeine-free, salt-free. But ego-free is too far for me. I got to keep some boundaries there, keep my sanity. Okay. So, but if you want to reach that highest level, we'll let you, and we'll just see if we can live with you. We'll see if we can. So how do we do this? How do we grow spiritually? We have actually, in our Unitarian Universalist Tapestry of Faith, there's a curriculum about it. So I'll pull some things from that. They have a nice little image here with spiritual growth and different practices. To grow in anything, you have to practice. If Robert wants to get better with the piano, he has to practice. If you want to get better in some physical exercise, we have to practice. So whatever we're doing and want to grow in, we know we have to practice. And you have to have spiritual practices as well. So people sometimes say to me, what is your spiritual practice? And I usually think they mean this. Here's one kind, and that is personal spiritual practices. This is what people usually are thinking about when they say spiritual practice, but it's really a lot more than that. Now, personal spiritual practice, are things that can be done alone usually, like meditation, dream work, journaling, prayer, and so on. You can do them together, and in fact, Laura has a group that meets here on Tuesday and Friday mornings at 9, and they meditate together. They do it, they're individuals meditating, but they do it as a group. And they find that is very meaningful for them to do. So some of the things you can do communally that you can also do alone. But usually people talk about personal spiritual practices as something they do alone. prayer, journaling, those kinds of things. And this is what most people think of when they say spiritual practice. They're talking about personal spiritual practice. But it's a lot more than that. Although UUs do affirm the individual nature of a person's spiritual path, we also, our whole movement is founded on a belief that community is essential to that journey. We think we really need community. Regular engagement with communal worship, what we're doing here, that ongoing and collective search for truth and meaning together through our sermons and songs and guided meditation times and other times, is one way of supporting this idea. And we do think that, at least I think, that congregational worship is a spiritual practice. So I am involved right now, you are involved in a spiritual practice. This is a spiritual practice. Congregational worship is. Facebook had this thing this last week that came up, and I tried it out. You could push a little button, and it would take all the things you'd posted in the last year and do a word cloud, showing the things that you emphasize, the words you use most. So I thought I'd share mine with y'all. So, for me, Sunday, yes, Sunday is good, and UUFS, you know, those kinds of things. These are the words I posted more than any others. And there's some others there as well, of course. But you know, Sunday, what's going on Sunday is so important to me. Spiritual partnerships is another way of having spiritual practice. I've got Sherry there with me. Sherry's actually up being a spiritual partner to her granddaughter this weekend because they've gone to YouthCon. But we have folks that we rely on, sometimes in small groups like our Evensong group, sometimes with one another. It could be a minister, but it could also be a therapist, or it could be a close friend or partner, but someone that you work with together and that you're sort of committed to checking in with each other for spiritual growth. Spiritual partnerships is another kind. And then another kind of practice is mind practices, growing intellectually. We think that's important as a spiritual practice. So we do that here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of States, but we think it's important. Bill Herring has a RE group he has now that they're looking at current events. And then they're analyzing, thinking about what it might mean. It's a mind practice. When we meet to discuss this book, Just Mercy, that's a mind practice. But it's a part of spiritual growth. And then, of course, body practices. It's all connected anyway, mind, spirit, body. So body practices, whether it's running or gardening, are important. Or doing something more formal like Tai Chi or yoga. Some sort of formal body practices where you practice being mindful as you are in your body. What the children did today was a body mindful practice. Then there are soul practices. Some people say that when it talks about in the Bible about us being created in God's image, what it means is we are meant to be creative. We are meant to be creators. And we hope that we can do some of that here in our congregation. In fact, next week is our talent show. And we hope you'll bring your creativity and come back and do some sort of talent. You don't have to be a highly talented person, but bring a poem to read or a song to play or a song to sing or any kind of dramatic reading, anything you might want to do to help us have a UU talent show and be creative next week and creative in our spirits. So your soul can grow with creativity that you do. And then you may need to move all of this from what we do in here, of course, into life practices. Whether you're practicing playing with your family or practicing at work, but move it into your life, your everyday life, your cooking, whatever you're doing in your life practices. Here we see Tina and James in the boat. They're moving that spirituality as they pedal out in a life practice there. And then we can't just do that with it. We've got to make the world a better place. And we can do that together through our justice practices. Standing together on the side of love, doing what we can as we work together to change the world and to make the world a better place. That's part of our spiritual growth and development. It's part of it. But here's the question people ask me. Do we need a congregation to grow spiritually? Now, I earlier said Unitarian Universalists think it's pretty essential, but do we really need a congregation to grow spiritually? Did you know that 23% of the American population are nuns? No, not these folks. Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, nuns. When you ask them what religious faith do they identify with, they put nun. 23%. They're religiously unaffiliated. Now, most nuns say they do believe in God, 61%, according to a recent Pew Research report. And most feel a deep sense of spiritual peace and well-being. It's not that they say it's not that they're not spiritual, but very few, only 9%, attend religious services, even once a month. They have no use for it. No use for church, for religious services of any kind. So, again, can we grow spiritually without a congregation? Well, probably yes. I think I'd have to say, if I'm being honest, I'm saying that I'm the minister. But I would have to say yes. But, I have a big but up there, but I think there are some reasons to come to worship services. Dr. Marcus Borg, he died earlier this year, progressive theologian. He said, to separate oneself from community and tradition on one's spiritual journey is like turning one's back on a banquet right in front of you and deciding to go out and forage for food by yourself. Just doesn't make much sense. He says community is the normative pattern of the spiritual life. If you've got a banquet, do you necessarily want to go out and look for it? Some people might. But here's another thing. Research says, and there is a lot of research on this, by the way. I'm just going to quote one thing. One of the most striking scientific discoveries about religion in recent years is that going to church weekly is good for you. It's good for you. Religious attendance boosts the immune system. You'll stay healthier. You won't get sick as much if you come to church every week. And it decreases your blood pressure. Now, this is real studies that they've done with blind studies and things, It may add as much as 2 to 3 years to your life. Yes, Robert?
Choral singing does the same thing.
But think, you can do it. You can do both. You can do both. You can sing together in church. Yes, it does. It's all good. It's all good. So, yes, there are good reasons. I think you can grow spiritually, but there are good reasons to do it together. And that's why we have this as our principle. Let's read it again together. We affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. In our congregations. Because we need to gather here sometimes to lean on whatever we think is sacred or holy, or to lean on one another. People need people too. Now, you may not need church every Sunday. You may get up one Sunday, I don't feel like I need to go. But it's not always about you, is it?
That's right.
That's right. It's not always about you. You may not need it that Sunday. But remember, there may be somebody else that needs the community, needs this community of folks here. Will you be here for them? It's important, folks. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms. Sing with me. Leaning, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms. Namaste.